Oxford University Prize in 2019. Apart from this, Narsareddy garu participated in so many democratic and civil liberties movements in Telugu states and other part of India also. He is very humanitarian. I think I myself I love to call him as a human touch, and he has this human touch, humanitarian professor. He is very close to democratic movements in all over India. Then another thing is he is very low profile. His studies and his all those research things. Apart from that, he has very close to so many important and world known professors. I think I welcome sir. You are you are here. We very fortunate, and I am very happy to see in this meeting as our guest and speak. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and I'm also grateful for the Center for Dalit Studies, Hyderabad, for inviting me to discuss an aspect of Indian Constitution. And that's how I chose this topic, which perhaps is likely to be of interest as we go on towards whatever we are thinking in terms of developed country. What I would do is I would divide my presentation into two parts. Although the things that perhaps are mentioned here, right from the directives, principles of state policy, and the neoliberal reforms are quite familiar, I would like to see the impact of the neoliberal reforms on what could be seen as some kind of a beginning we made towards that of larger social and economic transformation. I personally feel that there was some kind of a sudden kind of a break to this progress, although we may be progressing very fast in terms of what they call as growth of GDP, but that doesn't reflect actually what is happening to that of people. That's how I think the Indian Constitution designed an approach with an emphasis. I mean, it never talks in terms of merely bringing about growth. We don't find the mention of the word growth of GDP in the Indian Constitution. That's exactly the reason why I have tried to link is something which talks day in and day out in terms of only growth of GDP. That is, of course, neoliberal reform. Well, let me come back. I will make this presentation in two parts. The first part, I will just briefly refer to the much too familiar context in which the Directive Principles of State Policy as Part 4 of the Constitution was introduced, and the progress made right from the beginning of the launching of the Constitution. And then, of course, we do find that the expectations very, very high, but the achievements may be modest. But I think even this modest modest achievement in terms of social and economic transformation, where people matter, this has suffered a setback with the launching of the neoliberal reforms. That would be briefly my second part. And then, of course, I conclude what happened by way of, let's say, somewhat reversal of the progress, the limited progress we made on social and economic transformation. We all know when it comes to the question of the Constitution, we begin with that of Dr. Ambedkar's contribution to shaping of this Constitution. although he himself may not say that he made the constitution, but he certainly was instrumental in shaping the direction into which it was ultimately come about. In fact, the preamble of the constitution, where we, the people of India, give to ourselves a journey towards that of sovereign, secular, socialist republic, also mentions clearly that the path is supposed to be one that is promising ourselves a beginning with that of, let's say, intention to secure to all citizens justice, what we refer to in all dimensions, social, economic, and political. And in fact, it is this ambitious launch of trying to achieve progress which is measured in terms of social transformation as much as political and, let's say, economic transformation, that becomes core of the entire process that is set out through that of the Constitution. That's how we keep talking about Ambedkar's caution at the very launch of the Constitution of India, that he was aware that when we have this ambitious goal of socio-economic transformation, he thought that one must be aware of the kind of situation in which India was, and perhaps India continues to be quite some time, and how we should perhaps progress with this awareness. And this is the famous saying that when he was talking in terms that politically we will get one vote, one value, but when it comes to the question of the kind of graded inequalities in society and the kind of extreme inequalities in terms of incomes and wealth in economic aspect, it would be very challenging to think in terms of moving towards that of justice that is not merely political but also economic and social. In fact, here I would like to draw your attention, although this quotation is extensively used, that what he made as a speech to the Constituent Assembly on November 25th, 1949, much before that, even at the time of launching of, let's say, the discussions on developing a constitution, let's say constitution of the Constituent Assembly, that he, I mean, all of us are aware of his paper introduced at the All India Scheduled Castes Federation meeting in 1946, which was later published as State and Minorities, where he is raising the question of what are their rights, how to secure their rights through the Constitution of India. That was the question with which he approached the Constituent Assembly. In fact, he brought this to the Constituent Assembly, but there was, I think, given the composition of the Constituent Assembly, they thought it's too radical, because particularly Article 2 and Section 2 of this particular main paper, which he introduced, State and Minorities, they talk in terms of, let's say, state's role in trying to basic and key industries completely managed under its control. It also talks in terms of providing social security insurance to all citizens through that of the state's direct kind of a participation. And much more, perhaps this must have been because the Constituent Assembly had several landed interests. He said that nationalize entire agricultural land, redistribute it equally to those who are cultivators, and overcome the very segmentation or division of, let's say, agriculturists into that of landlords tenants and that of agricultural laborers. This sounded rather very radical for the way in which the Constituent Assembly was composed. And therefore, they just outright said that this is not perhaps possible to do that through Constitution. And that's exactly why he has come back with the proposal relating to that of directive principles of state policy. And it is in this context we see that it is somewhat, let's say, toned down proposal in moving towards that of instead of a radical shift that he was thinking in terms of state and minorities. This is some kind of a compromise kind of a strategy, but yet it's very comprehensive. And of course, I don't have to reel out the what may be called as the directive principles of state policy. It is set out as part 4, and it reads from Article 31 to that of 56. But the most important of these articles refer to that of, let's say, the first, of course, is that what the administrative aspect, that's 36, where he talks in terms of the state, and then, of course, 37, which is, of course, the way in which the directive principles of state policy should take the process of making laws to be implemented to the objectives. But I think the Article 38, and of course these articles did go through certain amendments, certain additions, and many of the additions are of course progressive. Let's say that to more clarify. The Article 38 talks in terms of state to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of people. And it also, later, it also talks in terms of minimizing specifically talks in terms of inequalities in income and to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, opportunities. In fact, as I mentioned, it rings, this is the one inequality, minimizing inequalities in terms of reducing status, many things like abolition of privileges, things like that come under that. This is an addition later to facilitate that kind of a radical change. And of course, a critical article of the directive principles of state policy is Article 39. It also went through that of several additions, and it lays down certain basic principles like that of ensuring means of livelihood, and in fact controlling both, in fact later distribution of resources, but widened in its scope, not only resources owned by the public or state, but also resources. It can, let's say, think in terms of distributing even private resources under certain circumstances. And the third is that of reduction of concentration of wealth, both of individuals and, of course, particularly corporate kind of wealth. In fact, monopolies and restrictive trade practices, and of course, the more easily understood and of course most often ignored, that equal pay for equal work of both, not only the equal type of work, but both the work of women and, let's say, the men. And of course, it also talks in terms of the children. This is exactly where talk in terms of strengthening the children's treatment at a tender age. Let's say this is exactly where we come to that of abolition of child labor, things like that. And in fact, the freedom and dignity of the particularly childhood and that of youth. And in fact, quite a few things come out under this particular ambit. More radical is that of abolition of child labor and abolition of bonded labor as well. And there is some addition which also talks in terms of free legal aid. This is where equality of opportunity, particularly before law, it cannot be, let's say, assumed that everybody, you may say that equality of opportunity, but it should be aided by the state. And that's how the equal justice and free legal aid comes into that, let's say, operation. And this is, I think, the core of, let's say, the entire directive principles of state policy, Article 39 and its clauses. And then, of course, there are also Article 41 talking in terms of right to work, to education. In fact, this drew quite a bit of attention in terms of, let's say, securing educational facilities, particularly for the backward and other weaker sections. And of course, the 42 also talks in terms of workplace conditions. I mean, there's something like Factories Act come under this. And then, of course, 43 talks in terms of it is not only work, but also providing this minimum wages. This is called talks in terms of living wage. And I will not go on to mention these articles any further, because this is, I mean, to give a tip, I mean, some kind of a feel of these things. They're all thought of as basic principles under 39. And then several things were also added there. In fact, the Article 45, which looked like just, this is a very, very much neglected article. For instance, the 45 talks in terms of the state shall endeavor to provide within a period of 10 years from the commencement of this constitution for free and compulsory education for all children until the complete age of, let's say, 14 years. But this was never done until the 2002, when we talk in terms of Free and Compulsory Education Act, where I think this article is equated with that of fundamental rights of 21, where it talks in terms of as a right. That is as we know that directive principles are supposed to be not justiciable to law. As the fundamental rights are the ones that are secured to individuals or citizens, whereas we talk in terms of directive principles of state policy in terms of society. And therefore, if the fundamental rights were to assume any meaning of in terms of freedom, including that freedom of speech, liberty, etc., you must have a society which perhaps is also going through a process that provides these kinds of right kind of atmosphere, these situations. And in fact, this Right to Education Act shifted this provision of education within 10 years. Now, of course, it is made compulsory, although, of course, it is not done to the satisfaction, in the sense that providing free compulsory education doesn't come with that of common school, doesn't come with that of, let's say, at least 18 years as it happens across the world. It is a bit truncated, then anyway, I'm not going to say that, but it's a good beginning at least, that what was neglected for a long time, at least in 2002, the Article 45 assumes or gets shifted into that of, let's say, Article 21A, where I think it assumes some kind of a status that has to be justiciable through that of, let's say, state's law. And when we turn to that of, let's say, the achievements under these acts, although there is a very meaningful and then highly evocative kind of, let's say, articles introduced under directive principles. The principles are good, but the direction has started. But I think right from the beginning, there are, let's say, some kind of, let's say, hurdles. There are always, let's say, people trying to contest, claiming, the individual claiming their rights as fundamental right, like, let's say, for instance, to property. When it comes to the question of, let's say, the rights that are perhaps supposed to be brought in through that of legislation under directive principles, they would always claim that it comes into the conflict of their personal or individual kind of rights. And this naturally meant intervention of judiciary as one of the important aspects of implementation of, although we cannot claim that individuals can't go and claim as a right to get these principles laid out under the directive principles. But I think it is the responsibility of the state. That's why we say it is the state's responsibility to see that these are implemented. But they can be questioned by those who think it comes in the way of their own, let's say, fundamental rights, which are justiciable. One can go to under Article 31 to any constitutional court and raise, let's say, objections. There are several objections raised. And then the process went on. In spite of these objections, there has been, of course, there are ups and downs, but over a period of time, at least, that's why we refer to at least until the introduction of what in mid-80s onwards, particularly this is where we come to that of neoliberal reforms, or what we refer to as the LPG kind of changes in the economic policy, state policy, which is the shift from the state's role to that of increasingly market role. That's where the whole break comes in. But until then, there have been quite a bit of, let's say, progress across. In fact, particularly as perhaps it's something like waves of, let's say, objections, waves of positive interpretations. In fact, that's how we move. A large number of, let's say, legislative measures were made by the state governments in implementing directive principles. And occasionally they faced objections in terms of, let's say, they're coming in the way of fundamental rights. But until I think this process went on, whether some of the directive principles under which a law is brought out, for instance, a law to acquire property for better purpose, or a law to nationalize, let's say, transport, to facilitate public transport, to facilitate better kind of, let's say, access to people, better access both in terms of charges and other things. Then everybody would raise a question, there is a right to property as a fundamental. And then it is in this that courts, particularly Supreme Court, has to intervene and then, of course, interpret it in a way that perhaps the objective of, let's say, the right in directive principles are larger social objectives. Therefore, if they come in conflict with that of, let's say, individual personal rights, how do you deal with this? This process went on, but ultimately, I mean, I'm saying it's ultimate, it can go on now also. But I think one interesting turning point is 1973. And of course, later it went on to up to 1978, also other amendments and all that. This 1973 case is the famous Keshavananda Bharati case, that he was a holy man from Kerala. It appears when the case was going on, people were saying that he didn't even know what was happening. Actually, it's a very large bench, and then it was a bench of something like 13 judges. And very interesting things are said about it. I'll not go into that. But one of the significant things about this Kechavananda Bharati decision was that that no law should be held. I mean, let's say there are 13 judges, 6 judges were for upholding the law which talked in terms of the right to that of, let's say, uh, fundamental rights are not necessarily ultimate. Directive principles in the process of any law in implementation could also perhaps move along with that of fundamental rights. And this is in the case that the 6 judges were on the one side and the 6 others on the other side. And in fact, the 7th, I mean, that this clinching vote it's upheld under with a majority of 7-6. And then the majority decision was no law shall be void on the ground that it is violative of fundamental rules, I mean fundamental rights, I'm sorry. If it is enacted for the furtherance of directive principles of state policy, which are of course for furtherance of social transformation. I mean, this is, I think, the one which perhaps led to several other kinds of, let's say, in fact, I would quickly read because it's very interesting. I read not so, I can read the name of the judge also, not necessary. I'll just say that what each one said. These, for instance, they talk in terms of both fundamental, one judge said, that positive side, both fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy are equally important, and there is no conflict if they are supplementing each other. Together, they become instruments for furtherance of constitutional objectives. And another judge talked in terms of the humanitarian socialist perceptions and aims of Indian social and economic transformation should help the interpretation of directive principles, laws promotion of promotion of the laws made to promote the directive principles of state policy as something positive and should not be taken as obstructing individual personal rights. And in fact, it went on, and then beyond this, this is, I think, the famous P.N. Bhagwati kind of, let's say, I'll mention this, because he said, I'm quoting it because it's very interesting kind of a interpretation. Directive principles of state policy, therefore, is an obligation on the state to take positive action for creating socio-economic conditions which are the will of an egalitarian social order with social and economic justice for all, so that individual liberty will become a cherished value and a dignity of the individual, a living reality, that without, let's say, this social value being honored, an individual will not be in a position to live in that society with dignity. Not only for a few, it doesn't become a privilege of not only for few, but for the entire people of the country. This is where you try to see that what is considered to be fundamental rights, individual rights, is now interpreted as their part of the social, perhaps, situation, that a privilege given to one person under an act may be a very narrow kind of a thing. Therefore, you find a social kind of, let's say, objective of everybody getting an equal right. It is only in framework of the socio-economic structure envisaged in the directive principles that the fundamental rights can achieve intended progress and operate, for it is only they can become, let's say, meaningful and significant for the millions of our people and deprived people who do not have bare necessities of life who are living below the poverty. And he goes on to give his interpretation very emphatically. And in fact, this is why from this interpretation onwards, it has always been looked at as, let's say, fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy moving side by side with equal kind of, let's say, importance. And then comes the question, what has been the achievements under this particular, let's say, uh, uh, process of legislative measures. In fact, as I said, by the end of, let's say, 2023, there were as many as 284 laws made in favor of fundamental rights, held as valuable kind of, let's say, legislative measures. It could be right from reservations down to that of, let's say, MGNR EGA, which of course later on came. It's beyond, of course, it came in a different circumstances. Several things which I think have helped promotion of the basic objectives of bringing about certain improvement in the social transformation. But I think by late 80s, particularly, we talk in terms of economic reforms, or let's say the neoliberal term from 1991. And in fact, I don't have to refer to that of who introduced, when it was introduced. We all know now, it's repeatedly talked about. It was Narasimha Rao's prime ministership, Manmohan Singh's finance ministership that was introduced. But it had a larger context also at the global level. It is not as if the Indian government brought these neoliberal reforms from out of the heaven. But there was pressure from outside because to make it simple, that when it comes to the question of end of Second World War in 1945, from 1945 to that of late 70s or even early, the so-called developed countries, particularly at the behest of the United States, which provided funding for war-torn economies like Japan, Europe, they funded redevelopment in the war. See, they achieved tremendous progress from 45 to that of 75, 80. There was expansion of capital goods, and then they were producing for the rest of the world, as we accuse these days of China. Therefore, huge exports were going there. They're able to, but there were certain crises. They were exploiting resources, particularly oil, from, let's say, the West Asia and using it for their energy. In fact, a country like Japan hardly had a drop of petrol, and then it was also one of the biggest developed country because it was hit by war, like Europe. It was both Europe and then Japan were aided by United States, and also they used an establishment like that of World Bank to give loans to the countries which are newly independent like India, and therefore use the loans, get their goods purchased here. That's how they produced. But I think by late 1970s, there was I think everybody knows the present, what we are seeing, the tragedy in Israel. There was a similar tragedy, Israel and Egypt, particularly Arab countries. And there was a setback, and therefore the Arab countries said that they had power, although they must have been defeated at that time because of the pre-dawn coup by the Israel militarily. But they had a much more stronger weapon like oil. So therefore they suddenly started raising the prices of oil. And countries which were developed, so-called developed, were hit because their energy sources were largely dependent on the crude from these countries. And therefore, the commodities became expensive. That means the material costs increased. And in the meantime, countries like India, China, which perhaps have developed from 40s, by 70s, 80s, they were also producing like our own heavy electricals, heavy machinery, and most of the capital goods also these countries were producing. There were declining demand for developed countries' goods, and they had increasing prices. They had to think in terms of some way of, let's say, overcoming the crisis in the developed countries. This is what we refer to the Washington Consensus, where I think at that time, both the President of the United States and then, of course, the Prime Minister of UK came to a consensus that they must make the developing countries or countries like India to open up their borders for their own investment, because their investments in their own countries, because of high costs, both wages and then raw materials, becoming less competitive. Therefore, they wanted, let's say, places to put their money which they have acquired largely. This is how countries like India were asked to open up their borders. This is where we talk in terms of neoliberal reforms having two dimensions. They talk in terms of what is broadly called structural adjustment. In fact, in economics, we talk in terms of one structure is the institutions which are central to that of production. Two institutions are state, and then the other is market. And this could be said, one is public, the other is, let's say, private. In fact, countries like India had a very strong public sector and control on as many as 18 major kind of what we call as basic and key industries, including transport, heavy machinery, electrical, telecom. All these were monopolies of the state. But these are growing areas. If the countries like India close themselves, that they will not allow investment in these areas where there is likely to be more demand and profit, there will not be any chance for the developed countries. That's how they forced countries like India. This is the external pressure. They made us, I'm talking about us in the larger context of India as well as developed countries, to open their markets for both selling goods and investment. This is how we have privatized one after the other. Most of the sector, there is hardly anything. Maybe they're also talking about private atomic energy now units in India as well as other places. And therefore, everything is kept open for them, insurance, banking, everything now. There is no holds barred for them to enter and make profits and sell their goods as well. This is how we got, externally speaking, the so-called neoliberal reform. Internally, the structural reform is, which is the dominant institution in the economy to promote, let's say, overall production in the country. Until 1991, it was the state, not only these 18 sectors, but also everywhere it was state-funded. Things like major funding institutions were IDB, industrial development banks. These were the funding institutions. In fact, LIC played a critical role as a state agency, not only giving dividends to the government, but also funding industries by investing in industries. That's one of the major kind of funding. These are institutions under state control. But all these things, although now LIC itself is in the process of opening up, but there are other life insurance competitors coming in. Same thing in every sector. So it is for this that so-called Washington Consensus introduced. But internally, the other part is the state role in economy was not only privatizing public sector, but also investment. In fact, only now we see some kind of a, what is called this concept of private-public PPPs, partnerships are coming in, even in, let's say, road building or even our own, let's say, metro, everything is PPP now. That, of course, everybody knows that PPP means the state shares the investment and the private perhaps shares its profits as well. This is what perhaps happens. This has happened. This has not only happened in, let's say, the industries, but this privatization, I mean, this, as we popularly refer to the LPG, so liberalization, let's say from the external point of view, we opened up, allowed them to invest, send their goods relatively with less of, let's say, taxes, and less of control on their investments. In fact, before 1991, our stock market was hardly known to anyone. Now that is supposed to be major. When they are talking about foreign investment, they're not talking about direct investment. They're talking in terms of only stock market. The huge profits are made that they take out. Because for them, the whole world now is the source where they can put one morning, they can invest in one country where they get higher returns. The next morning, they shift it to some other place, regardless of what happens to that country. That's happening to us. But in the process, our own, let's say, directive state policy, directive principles led kind of legislative measures. For instance, reservation. What happens when you, let's say, privatize public sector? In fact, the very next day, the entire records of what we refer to some kind of a reservation charts are rewritten. In the sense, there is no way that you think one would be, there is not even insistence when you move from private to public to the private sector, you should carry that kind of a what is called as reservation system. No. In fact, even in the most of the things that state used to do now are being contracted out to that of private sector, which means one of the major achievements, I would say, that is that of, let's say, providing positive, what could be called as assertive, reservations to that of, let's say, the weaker sections. But now that scope has contracted over a period of time. Once it is private sector, you don't have reservations. We may keep on demanding it, but I think nothing in that line is seen as seen. But the worst is privatizing education and health sector. See that opportunities for education, although one would say that there is a 25% under compulsory so-called education, under Right to Education Act. In the private schools also you have to provide 25% seat. The implementation is very, very, very limited. And worst of all, when the entire wealth generating activities, now we have a new word that is being used every time the finance minister talks about, she talks about wealth creators. You and I who work are not supposed to be creating wealth. Only very rich people with huge kind of, let's say, kind of properties. This is where I think kind of crony capital that perhaps has emerged, particularly in the last 10, 15 years. Earlier also this, right from 91, tendency to that of increased monopolies. In fact, under the directive principles of state policy, we had a very strong monopolies and restrictive trade policy. Trade policy with an act of the government. But we don't even know that in its place we have what is called competition commission. I don't know what competition. I'm not going to that. There's nothing like a competition commission where it checks. And of course, I don't have to give you examples of what is the competition. If you open up mining, public resources, you can even open up forests. You are opening up of Nicobar. See that it's grabbing actually, including that of your resources like petrol or crude oil. It's all become private monopolies. And in fact, as somebody was asking, who perhaps is the one, in spite of our own minds, again private, and you have huge import of coal. There are only one or two. One, we know that name also. So this kind of concentration of wealth is increasing. The two things happen. I will cut short my impact of the so-called neoliberal reforms. that privatization and liberalization through opening of the country, privatization through that of destruction of entire public sector control. And of course, this is because of globalization. We find that two major aspects, there could be several. I mean, but maybe I would say that three aspects. I would say what happened to that of employment, what happened to that of reservations, as I already mentioned, what happened to that of, let's, inequalities. We, we have many more world's richest people in India than many of the so-called developed countries. And we become, let's say, third or fourth biggest reservoir of billionaires. Well, that is the concentration of wealth. I'll come to that. Before that, I'll briefly talk in terms of the employment situation. See, that entry of private sector into that of even areas like, say, steel production, and even in, let's say, services like that of insurance. If you look at, let's say, their structures, they're increasingly the ones which are designed to overcome very assiduously planned labor laws, or so-called, let's say, Industrial Disputes Act, or let's say Minimum Wages Act, or, and in this place you bring in Contract Labor Act. And then when we refer to that, for instance, give an example. The very Contract Labor Act, which is supposed to be the one that prevents, if you have an industry, if it is steel producing, whoever is operating in steel production, any section, if there are 1,200 operations, any one operation is supposed to be employed in core activity. Whoever perhaps you can have some people, let's say, supplying something in canteen or some kind of a gatekeeping, things like that, maybe outside. That can't be interpreted in a different way. But now this core itself redefined. In fact, we had, in the pioneers of so-called neoliberal states, Andhra Pradesh was at that time, Chandrababu Naidu was the chief minister. He was the first state chief minister in opening up of his economy to that of, let's say, private investment. What he did was he meddled with that of our own Industrial Dispute Act and Contract Labor Act. To give an example, the Contract Labor Act in Andhra Pradesh was modified, amended in such a way that many activities which are core are reduced into that of non-core, which means in the non-core you can have contract labor, and in the core you will have, let's say, regular people employed with social security, protected wages, etc. But the non-core contract labor will not have any of those protections. And therefore, suddenly what's happening is, if you look at the so-called organized industry, the proportion of contract labor has been increasing substantially. Presently, more than 50% of the employees in so-called organized sector, or let's say in the contract kind of employment, without social security, without other benefits. And the other side is, we have a very huge kind of small marginal and other industries which are a bit outside kind of strict regulations under Industrial Dispute Act or Factories Act. And in fact, if you take total kind of employment in the country, almost 90% of employment is supposed to be informal employment, meaning you don't have protected kind of wages. You may have a schedule of minimum wages. If you look at any state, how much of that schedule minimum wages implemented? Hardly any supervision. In fact, the directive, again, I give example, combined Andhra Pradesh, the directive given to that factories department is that the inspection could be once in a year, or inspection could be only for hazardous, that too once in a year. This kind of relaxations meant the quality of employment, then the risks of employment have increased. And therefore, you find the rich becoming enormously rich. And in fact, opening up of contracts in public contracts to that of private, that's one of the huge kind of expansions. I would just, let's say, maybe not bring it to your notice as some of, I think since I'm just coming close to that of my, I must have exceeded. Let me talk with that of what happened to that of reservations. Now, this is, I think, when it comes to the question of, see, it is based on the reservations that Indian Constitution was praised as something which is remarkable. For instance, I would say this, I'm just quoting from my own paper. There are lots of studies. In fact, P.S. Krishnan, many of you must be aware, who was a civil servant, devoted his life for the actively supported the legislative measures, and even as a civil servant administrator, was known for his bias towards that of weaker sections. So, though there were attempts to address the problem of caste-based discrimination as well as denial of access to education and employment to the quote-unquote backward classes, here means all weaker sections during the colonial rule. One observation was that up to the first 30 years, there was some kind of a progress. And in fact, I would just perhaps quote Krishnan here, P.S. Krishnan. He talks in terms of the task of laying down comprehensive legal and administrative framework was left to the new government of independent India after colonial times. It was one of the central issues that drew the attention of the Constituent Assembly. The result was the Constitution. This we are talking in terms of now the directive principles. So it is the one of the important thing is the reservation policy, as it is called locally, but elsewhere variously it's called affirmative action, etc. When whatever you call it, that's call it what you will, for reasons social and political, but also historical. The core philosophy of underlying the Constitution is social justice. And equality is part of the basic structure of the Constitution. It is, I think, the Judge Bhargava who argued that Constitution of India, is a moral document because of this kind of consideration. Moral document embodying ethical vision, and that it needs to be understood and interpreted in terms of values and ideals. You see, from that kind of a situation, if we turn to that of the so-called neoliberal reforms, this is where again I refer to that P.S. Krishnan's work. The two dimensions reservations, this is about implementation for, let's say, 60 years that he is talking in terms of 2008 or so. So, okay. Some of the keen observers, that's why I'm talking about only Krishna, on reservation policies, implemented for over 60 years, feel that there has been slackening of the process in the last 30 years, that's after 90s, especially since the mid-90s, with the switch to that of neoliberal policies. During the first 30 years, there were improvements in the coverage, both under public employment and under admissions to that higher education in educational institutions. Reservations were extended to public sector undertakings and to the nationalized banks, and public universities were covered later. Reservations were extended to promotions of public employment as well. There was a high power committee. This is what one should note what happens. Certain institutions just vanish. As I said, monopolies, restrictive practices, legislation just vanished. Here is one. This is very important as to what happened after neoliberal reforms. Reservations were extended to promotion. Okay, there was a high power committee with the prime minister as the chair and senior union ministers, such as at that time Jagjeevan Ram, as members to provide direction to the implementation of reservations. However, since the mid 1980s, that's the beginning of, there were no frequent meetings of this committee. The committee was there at least at that time. Since 1990, there were attempts to bring in legislation to make the process of reservations effective and transparent. A bill to provide what is called as Arakshan Yoga Adalat. That means tribunals of justice for unprotected, to be located at the center, and the states to fast track implementation of reservations and settle problems arising thereof. The issue of enacting this law figured even in the United Progressive, that UPA government, their manifesto also in 1997, as much as in the Dalit manifesto of 1996, but the bill never saw the light of the day. On the contrary, a tendency toward dilution of reservation policy, especially in employment, has been observed since mid-1990s. Even as there has been growing demand for extension of reservations to private sector employment, in privatized public sector undertakings, rosters were revised and reservation recruitment was stopped. And this is, I think, again, the Thorat's paper also is then Krishnan's paper. Slackening of efforts to implement are not only because of the economic regime shift to neoliberalism, but also resistance and rising issues like the ones that reservations in employment were, that's a neoliberal philosophy, that it compromises efficiency and all that. I will not go on into that. I have no time, and therefore I'll switch to that of what happened to inequality. I think this is something I'll also quickly run through. There are reports now, I think, tracking as to what happened to that of wealth and incomes of people. That if you refer to that for simplicity, we classify entire population, adult population, into three categories. Those who are with the lowest kind of incomes, and then those who are, let's say, lowest 50%, and then, of course, the middle 40% and the highest 10%. What happened to their relative share? If you take into consideration up to 1985, that's the 35 years where I think we have directive principles of state policy active, there was a check on the extent of inequalities. For instance, the top 10%, which had about 40% share in the national income, continued to feel a little bit decline by 1985. It is top 10% income share from 1950s declined from 40% to that 30% by mid 1980s. But what happened after neoliberal reforms? By 2000, it has increased to that of 40%. By 13-14, that's when this government came into power, the central government, it became 55%. And the latest figure, 22-23, it is of 58%. That means the top 10%, we had a share of 40%. Presently have something like almost 60% of the total national income. What happened to the bottom 50%? They had a share of 19% in 50s. It has come down to that, it has shown some increase. It has increased to that of 24%. That's a positive thing in the first. I would attribute this also checks and then progressive measures involved in the first 30 years. And that it has started declining. And presently, this is about 15%. 50% who had 19% share in the beginning of this republic now have only 15%, whereas the 10% who had 40% will have 60% now. Not only that, this is of course the shares at the end. If you look at, let's say, what is happening on the 1 rupee of value generated in terms of GDP, how much goes to that of top 10%, middle 40%, and bottom 50%? See, for first, I refer to this 50, 35, 50, 30, 85, 35 years. During this period, for every rupee generated, I'm putting it as this percentages, therefore I can talk like that. Every rupee generated, the bottom 50% had 28% share. That means in income generated. By 2014, it comes down to 11% from 28%. And the top 10%, they had about 24 paise in every rupee that was generated. But by 2014, it becomes 66%. It is growing further. And therefore, you see, the inequalities are exasperating. It is largely because the tax structure, individual tax structure we had at some point of time very highly progressive tax. Sometimes it would go up to that of 60, 70%. It has been gradually reduced. For instance, today I pay 30% out of my pension as a tax. Ambani's pay, the marginal highest rate is 30%. Ambani's who earn, let's say, per day 168 crores per day. They also pay 30%. I also pay 30%. Next, when it comes, that means you're not allowing wealth makers, so-called wealth makers, to make money, but you don't take it. What happens to your education and health? That we know. And when it comes to the question of, let's say, it's not merely in terms of, let's say, the so-called income generated, but it's also in wealth. Wealth is, of course, much more disastrous. In fact,
Yes.
on,
Sir, sorry, sir.
I have to close it. Yes.
We crossed 1 hour, 10 minutes.
No, anyway, I make this last point.
No problem, sir.
And therefore, when it comes to the question of wealth, we know that 10% of people, top 10%, account for, let's say, this just mentioned this number, it stopped. In India, India is supposed to be the second highest inequality country after South Africa now. And therefore, when it comes to the question of wealth, of top 10% is 65%. This is 22, 23. Well, anyway, it's exasperating. And I close it with this one information, which I think I have gathered very guardedly. The national, now of course, two commissions. Earlier, it used to be National Commission for SC/ST. Now it's Scheduled Caste Commission. In its report of 2 years back, it has brought out a survey result, which we talk in terms of SCs getting, let's say, 15 to 18% reservation. But when you go to that of households, see that how many households, SC households, have someone employed in some place where he gets a regular employment. The number is very shocking because their share in the government jobs, number of households who have a government job among SC households, 0.73. Number of SC households who have a job in public sector, banks or even let's say railways, 0.17. Number of households who have a regular job in private sector, 0.45. Of course, the other side also, all other households, you take them, they're 3.56 for private sector. And of course, when it comes to government jobs it's about 5%, SC is about 0.73%. And therefore that reservations have taken away jobs has no meaning. If you take all the community's total households and then see how many households have this kind of reservation, instead of looking at that 15% is there, it's too much, it's gone. No. What does this 15%? You have a shrinking public sector and shrinking jobs reserved, and therefore you have shrinking households getting it. So therefore, majority of population, you talk of weaker sections or whatever you say, are not in a position to see an advantage of accessing better regular jobs. They remain in informal, insecure kind of jobs. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Sorry, sir, I interrupted. Yeah,
No.
I think you are you are going to talk. I am very. The one thing I am surprising, another thing I am sad for the situation we are facing now. I think this is a situation what we have to do. We can think about later. But on this lecture, I am inviting the participants to have any questions to ask um, Professor DNR Garu. Please feel free and you have a time 20 minutes. You can close it. No problem. Anybody is there to have a questions?
Yeah, I'll be very happy to.
I think you are elaborately told.
Is there anyone?
Arun, please.
Sir, the situation you very.
Arun, you have to introduce yourself.
Sir, this is Arun Kote from Lucknow. I'm involved on various social movement related to Dalit community. By profession, I'm journalist also, and I was very much involved since '92 that we were opposing that this new economic policy and other things that ultimately we were failed to restrict that. And it's true. Now the situation is very much clear that privatization is become a cruel fact before us, and we need proportionate control over the resources for our communities. And in the same time that we do have a political reservation, so we have a stake, though it is useless. So because the whips, political parties are using whips, so our political representation does not play any role over there. So now my question is, even in this situation, what could be the way forward for us? That is the major issue, because now it is very much clear that the privatization and we are not in position to stop the privatization. Within this given situation, what could be the possible measures we have to take to make sure that our people get access into all the resources and opportunities? Though it is a very big question, but I think so you can put some light on it.
No, you see, in fact, one thing. Let's see, if inequalities are, I'll not come to, inequalities are so exasperating, and the wealth is concentrating in fewer hands. In fact, they talk in terms of going down to that of even 1% of the population, adult population of India. They control more than, let's say, 40% of the wealth. Wealth and incomes also. See, the one non-revolutionary kind of idea, which is very simple. If you just tax the 0.04% of the top richest, their number is 92,000 people or so. The top richest people, if you tax them, tax their wealth, wealth here, let's say all those, their suggestion is all those who have net wealth of more than 10 crores. If you tax them, let's say at a rate of 2%, and then also similarly the richest income at the same additional 2%. They say that you get total revenue of something like 2.5% of GDP. We are spending in the country on total health less than 2%. That means with such kind of a small measure, it may appear small measure, but to say these are all estimates. No, you must be familiar because since you are in journalism, people like Piketty and they have what is called as a global inequality lab, where they are compiling country-wise huge kind of data. They come out with, let's say, if you just spare something, your top people 2%. We don't have wealth tax here. You don't have estate duty. Countries like Japan have wealth duty about 30%. United States has wealth duty, wealth and estate duties. I mean, we don't have. We introduced some time back. We abolished it. But at a time when you have huge kind of accumulation, second, of course, as you said, it's some other thing to restrict outright exploitation of resources. We don't know what is the value of your oil, coal, iron ore, all that are in private hands now. And then one single person, one single firm supplies coal to that of, let's say, half a thermal power, half the number of thermal power plants. Both this side and that side, the same person, the kind of manipulations they make, I don't want to talk about black money. They seem to be not aware of black money at all. They all make wealth creators. I mean, you don't have to, but one thing is true that we have, ultimately, these are all political actions. We have shades of political parties. I mean, the present shade is very strong saffron shade. I don't think anything even registers anywhere there because they are praising them in a budget openly. They are wealth creators. He's an ordinary worker. Just because you pay me wages, not even minimum wages, I'm not a agricultural labor, is not a wealth creator. But that is the attitude, and therefore, if you tax, wealth is disturbed, production is suffered. You talk of only GDP production, we are talking about distribution. Give a small portion, 2% of your wealth, the rest of the people would get better health. Another 2%, you will get better education. Now, this is the way, but I think it will not go on, hopefully, forever. I think there must be
Sir,
yeah,
one sub question within this, that we are as a community, we are the community which is contributing major on GDP.
Yeah.
On the basis of our labor and other thing, if you can see, we are the major contributor as a community to the GDP. So, will it possible to claim or demand that some level of some portion of the GDP for the upliftment and the support for our communities? Because I don't know whether any studies has been conducted. What are the contribution of the Dalits or the marginalized section into the community country's economy? That is somehow I feel that is very much ignored question within the economic fraternity.
No, in fact, you can certainly do that. It's not a big thing, but for instance, the estimates that we have. Now you can look at, let's say, the workforce distribution also. For instance, even now about 45% of the total workforce in agriculture. We know that what is the proportion of agricultural labor, what is the value generated in the total agriculture. Similarly, we can see each sector, the total number of employed within that, as I said, most of them are now, if you say that 80% is contract or let's say casual labor, and then only the 20%. And the 20% earlier would be very active kind of, let's say, whether trade unions. They have capacity to organize. But now a tendency has come that you don't even hear about, let's say, very strong trade union movement. Partly it is suppressed, partly there is a fear. that if you start acting, that you may lose your, because they're saying that, see, in fact, we had a conversation with, this you must have had, because you journalists are much more reach of people. You see that when we talk to that of trade union leaders, he's All India president of INTUC, old man, and then he said, why not mobilize in favor of, let's say, unorganized sector workers? He said, of course, he said, frankly, my own people don't want to do that because they lose bonus. In a factory, there are contract labor without any facilities like security of, pension or any such thing. Why don't you ask for their pensions and all? The answer is this. No, it will cut into our bonus. The neoliberal turn in the economy did not end with the economy. It has turned, privatization doesn't end with that of production here and there. Very psychology of people is increasingly individualized kind of thing. That's why when we refer to fundamental rights, which are very important for someone to become a rightful citizen, it's nonetheless personal. Whenever there is a conflict between directive principles which are socially oriented, that conflict is sought to be resolved by trying to reason, look, if there is demand for acquiring your, let's say, bus company, transport company, you must be content because it's acquired for public transport, cheaper transport facilities. And that's the argument. Private property is fundamental, right? But let's say acquiring it through that of a legislation for public purpose is directive principles. This has come, but when it comes to the question of mindset itself, now people are, let's say, highly individualized, and therefore, I'm not blaming people, but I think at least those who are in some kind of a reasonable position must be in a position to spend a part of their time and wealth for public purpose. That's perhaps, if not, they don't have money with much wealth, at least your time you can devote, educate people and then do that. But I think with the kind of very radical radical quote unquote, this right-wing philosophy which is sinking everywhere, right from the what is the difference you find in the philosophy between President of United States and the Prime Minister of India? They are of the same kind, no, that mindset. So therefore, you have to bring about, at least, we are saying political transformation. They globally now they accept because they are transferring wealth to so-called they take money where taxes are less. Now there is a global agreement, at least OECD countries, developed countries, they say that across the globe, there should not be any country which doesn't tax at least 15% of the income. That's not much, but at least that there are countries with 2% or 0% of income tax. So 15% is a beginning. Take it to 30%. And why in India? The neoliberalism is that kind of a wealth promoters, okay, they get money, but the corporate tax, can you imagine, reduced from 30% to that of 20%? Even the richest countries, they have 30% tax. In India, we need much more. Those corporations make such huge profits. And is 30% very high for the corporates? But of course, they reduced it, and which means you lose that 2% of the national income through giving this kind of reductions. And then inequality increases, but you don't have money to spend for your health, education, public transport, several things which are public. The word public good is gone. We used to think that there are public goods like education, health, which would never be private, but it's all become commodified. Therefore, in India, there is need for political mobilization. There are strategies. without perhaps you don't have to have an armed struggle to get the kind of changes, but you can do that as perhaps Ambedkar. I mean, in fact, when he presented this directive principles of state policy, someone criticized him saying that you are giving a what is called as outdated check to that of a bankrupt bank. But he said, I agree that I am giving a check, but not to a bankrupt bank. But I visualize this check would be, that means directive principle they are saying is a check to a bankrupt bank. But he said that it's a check which, if there are proper governments, can be encashed in a bank of the state. But that state is becoming bankrupt now. That is bankruptcy. And he visualized that, he cautioned at that time that the extent to which you can make your constitution work to the desired level depends upon the quality of your government you get. I mean, that's supposed to be one vote, one person, and then I think it's also one value. But what is happening, you know that I'm not getting to that of SIR of Bihar now. That's where we are. Hopefully something will come out of that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody is there? Okay. Sir, thank you. Thank you very much, sir. I think
Very much.
your presentation, I hope not only I open, it's a hope to think, to change how we'll go about it. I think in future we have to be, after these whole series, we have to go about what will way forward. That is the only one word we have to also think about it. All people like you have to guide. You have enormous experience and the scholarship on the issue, and I think it's a very wonderful lecture in this series. One
I
of
hope, I mean,
the
we are all optimists, we live by hope. I'm also hoping that by the time you have that conclave, I will write this paper. Okay.
definitely, sir. We are also already we are transcribing
Okay.
from your
Okay.
lecture.
No, I'll
Then
ask.
we will send a lecture
I'll
copy
ask
to
Ravi
you.
to give the transcript.
That is also we are thinking. Otherwise, it is not. We are trying. If it is not possible, I will tell you, sir, to write a
No, let him
lecture.
send the transcript. I will improve it. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I enjoyed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.